I'm Palami Chowdhury. I'm in the sociology department here, and I'm so delighted to welcome Smitha Radhakrishnan to Brown because I personally like her, but I also really love and enjoy her work, and I've been teaching a lot of it recently. So for those of you who don't know Professor Radhakrishnan, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. So Professor Radhakrishnan is, I hope I'm pronouncing this very long title correctly. That's like a very impressively long title, is Marion Butler McLean Professor in the History of Ideas and Professor of Sociology at Wellesley College. Smitha's work, she's a qualitative sociologist, and most of her empirical research has examined questions of identity, finance, debt, and international development with a specialization in gender in India, the US, and South Africa. Her recent book, Making Women Pay, Microfinance in Urban India, which I highly recommend. My students really liked reading sections of it, or those who did read it. It's always a question, examines the taken for granted practices of commercial microfinance institutions in urban India. And it's a fantastic book that looks at the gendered ramifications of microfinance and the sort of the classed and gendered intersections of its effects. She's very prolific. So she's also published another book, which I also teach, which I really recommend, because it's one of the few books that is really trying to theorize the intersection of neoliberalism and gender. And so that book, The Gender Order of Neoliberalism, which she co-published with Cynthia Solari, this book advances a multipolar feminist understanding of contemporary neoliberalism. And it compares India, the Soviet Union, the Philippines, and the United States, which I think is fantastic because it puts together countries that we often don't put together, but we should in sociology. I can go on and on. This book has received the Emanuel Wallerstein World System Section Prize at ASA. Smitha is also an amazing organizer, I must say. So she's currently the chair of the Global and Transnational section in ASA, and she was kind of the chair even before she was the chair. So I'm very thankful for her as a council member on this section. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Smitha, who I believe is sharing new data on her new project, which I find astonishing because you're just like, I'm not sure how you're doing all of this. So she's going to be talking about rural indebtedness today. And, this is based on a working paper. So she may tell us some areas that she would like us to provide feedback on or that she's thinking through. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction, Palami, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor and a delight to be here and share this work with you. As Professor Chowdhury said, this is a fairly new project. The data was collected in late 2023, and it's with a collaborator. It's co-authored, so this is actually my first venture into having someone there who is working on one part of it, and I'm working on another part of it. So there's a lot of questions about data collection and methodology. So I'm happy to talk more about that. So looking forward to an in-depth discussion. All right. So I'd like to start by introducing you to someone I'm calling Raki, age 30. She is the mother of 3 sons and works at a cafeteria at a large corporation in a small town in the highly financialized state of Uttarakhand. She lives with her mother-in-law and her 3 young children, and she earns about 9,000 rupees a month. So that's about $110 for about 26 days of work during the month. So in order to be able to take days off during the holidays, Raki will work 7 days a week from 9 to 5. And so when we met, she had been working 23 days continuously without a single day off. And although she's married, Raki's husband moved out 2 years ago and she receives no income from him. She does, however, foot the considerable medical bills for his mother, who lives with her. A year and a half prior to our meeting, she took a loan of 50,000 rupees, so the equivalent of about 5.5 months of her income, from a financial company, and she's paying it back at get 2,500 rupees a month, and she has to repay that for 2 years, and she only had 6 months left when we met. So I kind of figured it out. It's about a 20% APR, which is actually a great deal compared to the loans that I'm about to tell you about. And she found it to be more affordable than options that were available with loan sharks and money lenders in her neighborhood who run 120 to 200% APR finance rates, which I'm going to talk about. So Rakhi is under constant daily stress to make ends meet for her 3 kids and her mother-in-law, whom she is financially responsible for, even though her husband is no longer with her and doesn't contribute in any way. A few months prior to her meeting, she was wiping a windshield on her way to work amid heavy rain, and her foot slipped, and this ended up shattering the bones between her fingers and her hand. And although many advised her against it, she continued to go to work, unable to skip even a day and have her pay deducted. So after 25 days of this, the swelling got so bad she couldn't work, and she was forced to take 12 days off. The time off took such a heavy financial toll that she had to borrow money again, this time informally from a friend to make ends meet. And about 2 months later, she experienced a strange kind of feeling that she said took her breath away. And she later on found out that this was a mild heart attack. But she was so terrified to take time off work, she continued going to work and is just trying to do a little less while still showing up. So how did Rakhi get into such a rough situation? It would be easy to just sort of generalize it and say, oh, this is how, life is just so hard for working class women in India. But when you start digging into under the surface, there's a lot more to unpack here. Rakhi grew up in a relatively privileged priestly caste household, but she married an oppressed caste man of her choosing, which alienated her from all of her natal relations, turning her into a kind of migrant in her own locale. So she did not grow up with the assumption that she would work outside the home for pay, but now she has to work in order to feed her children. Her marital relationship broke down. Her dream of owning her own home, again, which she had previously done, has all but disappeared. And her declining health and unsustainable work life, exacerbated by expensive loan payments taken for medical costs that she's been saddled with due to kin obligations, make it even more burdensome. So Rakhi, I'm just giving you a detailed case to illustrate how gender, caste, kin, and breadwinning can over time coalesce to deplete the resources of individuals, families, and communities over time. So India has become a site of intense focus on financial inclusion for over 2 decades, even though efforts to get fair finance to the majority date back to colonial times. And I'll say a little bit about that later. In parallel with the expansion of global financial capital since the 1990s, however, this focus has intensified worldwide. 8 of the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals require financial inclusion as a prerequisite. The record on the outcome, however, has been decidedly mixed, as I'm sure many people in this room would be aware. So on a macro level, financial inclusion is associated with less vulnerability in the country overall, and there's some evidence that access to financial services can serve as a buffer against poverty. Indeed, this has continued to motivate even more aggressive financial inclusion policies in India across party lines. But access to a bank account alone does little to alleviate vulnerability. Indeed, my own previous work on India's microfinance industry, building on the work of many others, argues that new financial products targeting the poor include previously excluded groups on a disadvantaged, or what Marcus Taylor has previously called, adverse basis. Still, the bulk of work on financial inclusion either focuses on this macro impact or at the individual or household impact. And there isn't that much that actually looks at the bottom up. So I'm trying to get at not just what is extracted up, but what is depleted, not just at the individual level, but also at the household level, thinking about it as mediated through structures, including gender and caste. So in this paper, my collaborator, Safal Batra, and I aim to integrate these individual, household, and structural understandings, focusing on economic hardship. So one of the claims is that financial inclusion can help us understand economic hardship better, or can help those who are liable to face extreme economic hardship, that it can provide a cushion. So here we are looking at two key questions for this paper. What kinds of loans do employed women and men in urban India take in times of economic distress? And secondly, how do the structures of gender, caste, and household composition shape the financial strategies of low-income Indian workers? These might need a little wordsmithing, so I'm still working on it, but this is what I've got so far. So more specifically, we're curious about under what circumstances are vulnerable households able to renew themselves to be able to aspire to social mobility? And in contrast, what factors contribute to individuals and households becoming depleted over time, facing a higher likelihood of long-term illness, injury, or untimely death, which we kind of get a sense of that from Rakhi's story. And I'll be giving you a few other examples. But our interest is in the ways that debt really informs this. I realize that I don't have my phone here, so I just wanted to, how much time should I have?
So it's until 3:30.
Okay.
You're good for like 40, 45 minutes.
Okay, yeah.
You want me to give you a 15-minute?
I mean, I just wanted to get a sense of like when you wanted me to end. So if I end before 3 is like good. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe like
3:45 or so. 3:45, 3:50?
Or 2:40.
I mean, 2:50 right now. I meant before 3. Yeah, before 3. No. Yeah, okay, 2:50. That's perfect. Okay, I'm just setting myself up for how many details to talk about. Okay, great. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about how we can think about financial inclusion and economic hardship together. These two are often not brought together. And my purpose here is to try to bring a more intersectional understanding to both of these topics, which are often viewed in isolation from one another within sociology. So when we think about financial inclusion, when we think about economic hardship, sociologists have spent a lot of time thinking about how especially families and communities that are susceptible to poverty deal with economic hardship. We don't have a great theory about this. It's more, we kind of have, more as I would say, individual or household level explanation. So let me just focus on India. Of course, there's different contexts, there's different explanations for this. So in the Indian context, the literature on economic hardship is quite dispersed. There isn't really like a sustained study of just this topic, but we suspect from the literature that if a family or a household has come upon really hard times and is faced with an acute economic crisis, then it might be because they need more financial literacy or better money management. So when I was working my research in microfinance, this is the taken for granted view that if folks in the bottom billion just manage their money a little bit better, if women in particular kept track of all their income and expenses, and if they understood financial products better, had more control over financial autonomy, then when that big medical bill comes, they will be prepared to pay it. And women are good at saving, right? So there's a whole literature that in various ways thinks that if poor people just distinguish between needs and wants, manage their money better, then they will be able to meet the needs of economic hardship better. Then there's a little bit more structural explanation, which says that, well, it's really about lack of resources and opportunities. So people have come across economic hardship or a big economic shock because for various, structural or geographic reasons, they don't have, access to, these are unemployed men sitting around, good jobs. They're not able to get the kinds of income and resources that they would need to get by. And then finally, there's the most structural explanation out there, which is also a general one, which is that poverty is due to an intersection of caste and class. And we need to somehow alleviate these structures in order to be able to address the kind of burden that economic hardship, an economic event, puts upon folks. So I'm trying to come to, looking at all of these things, a more intersectional understanding of economic hardship, drawing on some new interdisciplinary literature. So I'm very inspired by Cecilia Van Hollen's work on South Indian women who are experiencing cancer, as well as Isabel Guerin's collaborative work with two South Indian anthropologists and they're looking at the embodied dimensions of debt. And what both these works suggest is that anytime there are financial transactions taken out, when they're taken out by women, it really impacts their bodies, right? And that there is actually, when we're talking about debt and financial exclusion, we cannot or inclusion, we cannot exclude the body as in that scale of analysis, because that's actually the site at which the loan is being taken. And Isabel Guerin's work with Venkata Subramaniam and Santosh make the claim that essentially when women take a loan, they are putting their bodies on the line. Right. So, and the anthropological work by Van Hollen has a slightly different take on that, but it very much thinks about debt as embodied. Then, during COVID, many of you will be familiar that in India, the mass reverse migration of workers from cities to rural areas, and the tremendous unevenness with which COVID landed in terms of its impact in India really brought to light the intersectional disadvantages that different groups face, right? So that was true everywhere in the world, but certainly in India, certainly in the United States, that it's not just the disease didn't land everywhere the same, right? And that sometimes the advantages and disadvantages were unexpected. So there were some rural areas that were actually quite protected. Migrants were actually hit the hardest in terms of both livelihood as well as health. So there are some interesting details that complicate taken for granted understandings of inclusion and exclusion. It wasn't just that people who were more included were better off, right? It was much more complicated than that. So it suggests that we need to look at a dramatic, acute historical economic event in a way that considers multiple identities. And then finally, and this is what I'm going to spend a little more time on, Shireen Rai has recently come out with a book called Depletion, The Cost of Care. And since I'm a social reproduction scholar, I've been very attracted to this framework. And what I like about it is that it uncovers depletion as a key experience and impact of economic hardship. So it's not just about, how do they manage and get through it, but what toll does it take on physical bodies and communities and families, and in the ability to continue to care in order to sustain families and in order to sustain communities, and that is not a one-time thing. It's happening over the course of time. So Shireen Rai offers us a lens for thinking about feminist political economy that I think can really deepen and complicate our prevailing understanding of financial inclusion. So this perspective recognizes that the labor of biological, household, and cultural reproduction involves care work that's primarily undertaken by poor women. And so if social reproduction is the hidden set of processes that sustains capitalism, then depletion is the cost. Right. And we don't often look at the cost. So she actually takes this framework from environmental economics and says, we actually need to look at the cost. And, I felt a little called out when I read this initially, because my previous work has been about extracting. Right. So where does the value come from, but not necessarily. And then what toll does it take on those communities from whom labor is extracted, right? Or value is extracted, or, interest is extracted, right? What is the cost of that? So this gives us a way to get into that. And the story, like the one I shared with Rakhi, it was very clear that there is an ongoing depletion that is going on that is structural in nature that we don't really have a very good language for talking about. So depletion, then, the way that Rai defines it, results when the outflow of social reproductive labor exceeds the inflow of resources, tipping those affected over the threshold of sustainability. It's been very well documented by Sohini Kar and others who have worked on debt, that debt itself is work, that it takes a lot of work to take out the loans, to service the loans, to show up to the meetings, to make the relationships with the loan officers. All of that happened. So I actually think that although Rai is not specifically looking at indebtedness in her book, that indebtedness is a great site at which to look at it. And as you'll see in the study that I'm about to share with you, I'm not just interested in women, because I think these same issues about depletion apply to men who are in oppressed caste as well. And in fact, myself included, have sort of looked at women to the exclusion of men without necessarily interrogating gender as a category or thinking about the social reproductive cost of care that both men and women bear, even if those dynamics look a little different for men and women. Okay, so the other nice thing that I like about what she calls DSR, depletion through social reproduction, is that it looks at multiple scales, which I have examined before. So at the individual level, she invites us to look at physical and mental depletion measured through BMI, tiredness, sleeplessness, reduced self-worth, insufficient time for oneself, loss of friendships, right? Useful framework even for thinking about any context, certainly in India, but in the US as well. This is all sounding very familiar, right? At the household level, decrease in collective household resources, including time lost due to longer work or commute hours, failure to manage family needs, lack of disposable income, right? So this over time is going to deplete the family, the household unit. And then at the community level, right, depletion occurs through a shrinking of community resources, spaces, time commitments, and an erosion of community networks. So when we start thinking about depletion in this multifaceted way, we can find lots of different applications for this. And it gives us a language to talk about really the cost of neoliberalism at multiple scales, but also that cost is borne differentially by different groups of people. Okay, so this is the favorite quote that I pulled out. Depletion fundamentally affects the material conditions of reproduction and the maintenance of social life. Depletion harms those who care. Depletion is harm, right? So that puts a very different spin on the story of Shireen as something which is everyday and ongoing and not anything that we can do much about, and rather turns to what are the specific mechanisms through which this harm is being perpetuated, and how can we understand individual stories within the context of this much more systemic process. So our argument is that formal financial products filter through existing inequalities. The financial and social strategies that breadwinners undertake reflect individual and familial vulnerability in terms of gender, class, and caste. High-risk debt, which I'll define in a second, depletes individuals and households over time, ultimately compromising community resilience. And this is a framework that, again, it's preliminary, so I would love your feedback on it after I've presented a little bit more evidence, whether you feel like this is something I can substantiate, or is this too big and it needs to be narrowed down for a particular paper. I look forward to your thoughts about that. Okay, so I've put breadwinning in quotes here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context and what we did. And Paharpur is a pseudonym. So this term breadwinner is one that I've been struggling with, and I would love some feedback about. The taken for granted meaning is that only men can be breadwinners. And indeed, we did interview mostly men with fewer women. And I'll explain why in a second. But the women who are working were absolutely breadwinners. And so I'm interested in kind of thinking about how we can critically reimagine that term in a way that's sociologically useful. So that's something that I'm working on, and I'd welcome your thoughts about it. Okay, so India, as I said, is an intensive site of financial inclusion. There's a long history of financial inclusion initiatives really dating back to colonial times. And then from the 1970s and through the 1970s, there was a very intensive focus on cooperative banking, which really is the precursor to financial inclusion, although it wasn't considered that way. So in my book on microfinance, that whole chapter about like microfinance's history took me the longest to figure out. It was the hardest, because I didn't think microfinance was a case of microfinance, right? That it was actually an intervention that came after a long history of banking strategies that were oriented towards, previously disenfranchised groups. So, and so there's a long story there that I'm just going to put with this one bullet point. But, in parallel, really from the 1990s, the World Bank starts promoting financial inclusion. And there it's focused on access to credit, savings, pension, and insurance products for vulnerable populations. This really peaks in India with the microfinance boom in the early 2000s. And it's still going strong. So it's not that because there's been criticism, this commercial industry has tanked in any way. It's had a few crises along the way. It's always on the brink of a crisis, but it is growing strong, extremely lucrative. And one of the trends that I outline in my book is that microfinance in particular, this commercial practice of giving small loans to groups of women, is actually the leadership has entirely been masculinized as it has become a financialized product. So it used to be that these were organizations run by women who were coming from the NGO sector or from the education sector. And as this industry has become more commercial, it has become masculinized almost entirely. And the people who are running it are really upper caste men. And that's where the value goes in the industry. So since 2005, the Indian government has really refocused attention on financial inclusion, and new schemes under Modi they have meant that there are new digital identity tools, new payment tools. So you know about the UPI, and there are several schemes that ensure that everyone has a bank account. When I was looking for some figures to substantiate this for this talk, I found one figure that said that compared from in the last 20 years, India has gone gone from an official figure of 20% financial inclusion to 85% in 2023, which is really, huge. And so what does that mean? It means that they have a bank account. Right. And so as I'll show, it is not really this more fulsome idea of access to fair credit and savings that would protect them from financial harm. Okay, so why Uttarakhand? So Uttarakhand is a new state that's gone through a very rapid financialization. So it was formed in 2000. It has extremely high levels of economic growth, especially relative to the region. There are very high levels of banking penetration. It falls a little short on deeper inquiries about financial inclusion. So there are already folks who are, publishing papers more recently who are saying that, there's a lot of banking, but the demand for credit is not really being met here. So it's, relatively literate, relatively prosperous. It's hilly. It has a lot of different ethnic groups. And as I said, it's a new state. What's also interesting is that there are high levels of caste mobilization in Uttarakhand, but also a number of incidents of caste-based violence. So it's a site where people are thinking about caste a lot, and it's at the forefront of people's minds, both in political and social life. So in a sense, studying Uttarakhand, especially urban Uttarakhand, offers this best case scenario for understanding how financial inclusion works or doesn't work, because these are folks who are working, it's literate, financial inclusion is supposed to have more or less succeeded. So how does that actually impact people when they are encountering an economic crisis? So we interviewed, to sort of sweeten that a little bit further, we interviewed folks who were employed, mostly earning stable income. So we looked for people who were not just, some of them are employed part-time, but the majority of them say that they work full-time and that they have a predictable income that they could report to us. Sorry that this it's not responding to am I doing something wrong? Oh no, it went to the keyboard is very sticky. Oh my gosh. Sorry. It's not going to the next slide. Go to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So we conducted 188 interviews with working class men and women in a town that I'll call Pahadpur, a small town in Uttarakhand. It's mostly men in our sample because we went out there. So I was there for part of the launch of the study. And then there was a group of graduate students, mostly men, who were approaching people for interviews. And so because of the way that it was done, it was mostly men. It's also men were much more accessible. It was easier for me to interview women. So I'm highlighting more women in this presentation because it comes from my interviews and because I had longer interviews with them, but the graduate student team, and I'll show you the different kinds of data that they collected. But most of the people that we talked to earn 10 to 15,000 rupees a month. And from their occupations, we can infer that they are mostly folks with oppressed caste identities, but membership in these groups can be quite complex. And as I'll share with you, although we asked questions about caste, they didn't always respond in predictable ways, and narratives of caste came out in unexpected ways. So we analyzed interviewee reports about past and present loans for the whole group. But then we focused on a subset of 37 workers that were employed by the same organization that had similar incomes, similar employment, in order to get to these questions of precarity, depletion, and caste, within the smaller subgroup. So that's kind of how the study is structured right now. Okay, a little bit about the population. So as I said, predominantly men, 33 women who are in the sample. I could not change those headers to men and women. I really tried, but it says so. It's imputed by the interviewee. Majority of folks making between 10 and 15,000 rupees, which is well above the poverty line in India, but actually pretty close to the average considered income. In this context, they would be sort of working class or precarious. There are some people, including people that I'm going to talk to, who report a higher monthly monthly income, and some that report lower, but they're mostly either in this 10 to 15,000 rupees range or 5 to 10,000 rupees range. Figuring out occupation was actually really complicated because people talk about their occupations in a bunch of different ways. So we came up with like 16 different categories that I think covered the majority of the ways that people describe their occupations. So a lot of factory workers, a lot of service workers, drivers, some manual laborers, and quite a few that were working for the same office or institution, gardeners, a few shop owners, and a few domestic workers with a few others mixed in there. Okay, so what we expected going into the study when we asked folks about their experiences of economic hardship and the strategies they deployed, we were asking them also about all the loans that they've taken from formal and informal sources. So we expected that they would primarily be taking loans through formal financial institutions. It could be microfinance or other things, but that there would also be some informal lending. But primarily, we thought it was mostly going to be formal because this is a highly financialized state, and we were interested in maybe how they're also taking informal loans alongside that. And we also predicted, and I thought based on my own work, that men and women are actually going to access very different financial streams, that men are going to have access to maybe, business-oriented kinds of loans, and women are going to have access to microfinance, and that there's going to be this gender differentiated access to finance. So not at all what we found. So this question then of does financial inclusion equal access to fair loans is what we ended up being able to address. So I'm going to just put a little bit of preliminary, like a few charts and preliminary data of what we found, but the categories of what they are there's open to debate. So I'm looking forward to your impact. So one is the question of prevalence. So the majority of people reported that they did take some kind of loan, but there were 35 who said that they hadn't taken a loan at all. Now, this is interesting because a lot of times people will, I'm not even sure that I believe them, because a lot of times people would say, no, I've never taken a loan. And then later on in the interview would be like, well, there was that one time there was this medical emergency and it was, so there's a little bit of taboo around talking about loans. So those 35 people who said that they never took a loan, I'm not completely sure that that's true, but that's what was reported. But still, despite that, we have the vast majority of folks that we spoke to reporting that they have taken a loan. We did record 2 credit sources for each person, and that oversimplifies things a bit, but we had to put some kind of parameters around it. And so we only coded for like 2 reported sources. Not all loans are in response to economic distress. So I'll talk about formal and informal, but the picture ended up being quite different than what we expected. So so I said about never, right? So we came up with this gradation for the types of loans that are out there. And I won't go through this in detail, except to say that it was not easy. Like I thought I knew the landscape of debt in India, but it's actually so much more complicated than I expected. And we have, I would say, a pretty poor sociological understanding of the different kinds of debt that are out there. Coming out of my microfinance study, I felt, one of the things I talk about in my book is that working class women in India, in urban India, are encountering a saturated financial ecosystem where they are very adept at manipulating, multiple financial products. Okay, so it's way more saturated than I thought, and it is not only organized by gender; it's also organized by neighborhood, whether or not you have access to farming income, how much land your parents have, and a whole lot of other things that mediate whether or not you have access to loans. So the formal loans, so we coded it with this yellow, green, red coding system, which I'm not even sure I totally believe because, for example, the informal loans with no interest, which often come from relatives or friends, can actually cause a tremendous amount of mental strain. And often people who will say, yeah, I took this loan from a money lender to pay off my aunt. Right. So, this is, I'm putting red, yellow, green because I need a coding system. But right, it's very clear that the yellow zone ones could be red. The red zone ones may actually come with some relief that they were able to get the money right away, like in some of the examples that I'm going to offer. And that those formal loans with higher interest that I've made light green are actually microfinance loans and chit funds and other kinds of financial products that come through fintech that could actually be, pretty complicated in terms of pretty high interest rates, pretty restrictive terms, with very few options of how to pivot around in them. So, I'm not sure if it's just the level of exploitation that is the thing to code here. There might be other aspects to it. But again, difficult to capture this information systematically. People talk about it in different ways. And so to actually get it into some kind of a unified typology is difficult. But this is something that we're working on. So that question, now, can employed men or women access bank loans? Maybe this is like the kicker, right? So the majority of those we interviewed reported never having gained access to a formal loan. So even in this best case scenario with people stably employed, they could not get a loan from a formal financial institution. So in this chart, the false indicates those who have never taken a formal loan as well, who have never taken loans at all, as well as those who have taken informal loans. So you have to I had to aggregate those together. But yeah, only just about a third of the folks actually said that they had taken out a formal loan. And in most cases, it wasn't a bank loan to protect against economic crisis, but, like taking out like a bike loan or some kind of a consumer loan, also with high interest, but a smaller price tag that could be paid off over time through an automated kind of system. So again, so much less prevalent than we would have thought, given the data that we have. And then this is another thing that we're kind of working on to try to figure out how to count it. But we tried to look at how many had taken, what was the most exploitative loan that folks took, right? And so if you see here that those red and yellow loans really make up the vast majority of loan experiences that people have, right? So it's almost, if you put those together, right, it's like almost double the amount of people who have taken formal loans who have taken these loans that come with various kinds of stress and obligations, high interest rates. Actually, the restrictive loans and high interest rates could also be part of the formal loan category because microfinance is in there. So we're really talking about money lenders, things that are outside the gambit of what would be considered financial inclusion. So that's where the majority of lending is taking place. This is preliminary. I have to redo this chart with all the data that we validated, but there is some overlap, right? So we said people reported 2 loans. So you see people who reported formal loans are also taking informal and exploitative loans often, right? So they're not completely separate groups. It's not like, oh, once I take formal loans, I don't have to worry about anything else. We had expected there to be some overlap. And in fact, I thought there would be even more, but the kicker here is that the majority of it is in that yellow and red zone. Okay, so now let's just sort of focus in a little bit more on that subgroup and how individuals and households respond to economic distress. So thinking about questions of indebtedness and depletion over time. So we have sort of 3 categories that we came up with, and I'm going to give you an example of each category: protected breadwinning, precarious breadwinning, and depleted breadwinning. And here I'm using both men and women, and they have different characteristics. So I'll talk about each of them in turn. So this is Vijay, a landscaper who earns sort of 13,000 rupees a month. He is local to the area. He's from Uttarakhand. And he actually reported a number of pretty intense health crises in his family, which in this sample were the majority of reasons that the majority of people who had an acute economic crisis, it was because of healthcare. So he had several, it was a complicated birth of his son. And I'll come to that in a second. And he always was able to sort of resolve this with loans from family members. His wife does not work. She did work previously, but after the birth of their son, stopped working. And although the interviewer did not get into it, it was clear that he felt that she should be at home and take care of him. And that she wasn't earning an income. So the only income was this 13,000 rupees a month. But as he continued on, right, we found that he was quite happy with his level of income. Although he wished he could be a little bit more comfortable, he had a family network that offered loans. Although he said that caste doesn't matter, and that in fact, when his wife needed a blood transfusion, that an OBC person gave her blood and saved her life. He was very clear about that. Like, blood has no caste. We are all one. And yet he referred to his Brahmin identity frequently throughout the interview, and in fact aspires to someday be a priest in a temple where he feels that he can have more status and a more satisfying life than being a gardener. Also, his family owned land in another town, and that was his security. So the house that he lived in, he wasn't paying rent because he had sold land somewhere else and bought this apartment. So that wasn't a constant strain on his life. So when you look at this entire thing, Vijay, with 13,000 rupees a month, is quite optimistic about the future. He feels relatively secure. He has, aspirations to educate his children, and he feels like, things could get better on the whole, and that this is a reasonable income for him to be able to build those dreams on. Okay, so this is protected breadwinning, and we can talk about what are the aspects that are protecting him here. But certainly, caste, land ownership, family networks, and also he's not a migrant to the state. Okay, so in contrast, here's Kavita, age 29. She works at the same corporation. She earns also 13,000 rupees a month. She's a migrant worker from Uttar Pradesh. She was very open about having an oppressed caste identity. She defines herself as uneducated, and she reports extreme physical exhaustion. The whole interview, you can just hear how tired she is. She cares for 2 children and her mother, who all live with her. She's married, and her husband works in a coal factory. He earns 9,000 rupees a month and loads coal it's a very physical job. He's actually like loading coal all day long. Also, so thinking about that physical depletion part of it. Now, that means they have a household income of 22,000 rupees, and we would think like, hey, they must be doing a lot better than everyone. And they don't have extended kin obligation, but they've had so many repeated health issues, multiple loans from loan sharks and pawnbrokers, and they are completely depleted so here I say precarious because they have a higher income, but they are, not very many aspirations for the future. She doesn't feel like she can get a better job. She went into a lot of detail about the restrictions on the job, like there's not as many women who work at that corporation in this janitorial roles, so they don't have proper bathrooms. She's unable to ask for a raise. She's been working there for many years, doesn't feel like things can get any better, right? So, I define Kavita as precarious, sort of one stressor away from permanent ill health or worse. Okay, and then finally, I want to talk about what depleted breadwinning works. And I'm not sure, perhaps in the final paper, there'll just be 2 categories, because I feel like there's an intermediate category, but it's a little bit hard to, draw those lines very strongly. And I'm still sort of coming up with how to clean this up. I think it's useful to have that intermediate one, but it may not, I don't know if I can substantiate it completely with the data, so I'm working on it. But this is Binod, also age 29, also earns the same salary. He's also a migrant worker from a rural part of Uttar Pradesh. Talks about having an oppressed caste identity. He names it in the interview. And he talks about having a very, very, deprived childhood in a rural area without shoes and without access to basic amenities. And so he feels that he has actually improved in his circumstances, having gotten this job. But when he was in a medical emergency, he could only get loans from the loan sharks and from the money lenders. And he was very clear about the fact that even though he has worked in this particular corporation for many years, and it is a stable job, that this was his only option. And this was a very vivid story in the interviews where he talked about his wife about to deliver their first child. The baby was breached. They needed a C-section. They went to the government hospital, and the government hospital basically said, we can't do anything for you if you want her operated. You have to go to the private hospital. So he goes to the private hospital, and they want 40,000 to admit her. And so he ends up not having any kind of recourse. doesn't have anyone in his family who has that kind of money. So he actually calls his father in the village, and his father took a loan from a village loan shark to come up with that 40,000. And he said, in the interview, whether it's you show up for that surgery or I show up, it's the same 40,000, right? And it's interesting, when I was doing this research and talking to other researchers in India, they were like, oh, but there's a new government scheme for that. That should have worked for him, right? Yeah, but it didn't, right? Like, they're not making it up, right? So there's a real kind of, that's another story we can talk about if people are interested in, but there's a real denial of how dire the situation is for folks who are fully employed, who are, supposedly doing well, but face these kinds of like tragic life or death things on a pretty regular basis. He has extended kin obligations. There's always people asking him for money. His wife is chronically ill. The problematic birth was not the first one. The second one was also a difficult birth, also required another loan. And so he expresses no concrete aspirations for the future. He's struggling monthly to pay off debts and care for his wife and children. So despite upward mobility, Binod's household is actually approaching depletion. So I just made a graph out of what he reported to me. He took a 50,000 rupee loan for one medical emergency. The terms are 5,000 or 10% interest due each month, with the principal due in a lump sum at the end. Right, so that's 120,000 or 1.2 lakhs of interest alone after 24 months, and the cost of the principal plus the interest after 24 months is 170. So this is normal. Everyone seems to think that this is okay, and this is the way that the majority of working class and poor Indians get their medical needs met. So this is a quote from Binod. Banks will not give people like me loans where the interest is less, because even though I've been working here for many years, ultimately I just work for the contractor. And in a single moment, this job could disappear. If they decide I'm not doing a good job, I could lose it. And I come from a poor family. I have neither property nor land to show. The banks will never give me ever. The only way is to take loans from those in the village who will give you money immediately. Okay, so I'll just wrap up here. So what I hope to have convinced you of, that financial inclusion is embedded in social reproduction. If we think about social reproduction as something intersectional that's informed by multiple social identities and structural forms of violence, then we cannot understand financial inclusion on a macro scale without understanding these other kinds of scales. Access does not equal inclusion. Being financialized does not necessarily provide a reasonable cushion for those dealing with economic precarity, which is something that can't necessarily be addressed through inclusion alone. So the question of fair finance is really, really different than the question of inclusion. And that point actually there isn't much of a scholarly conversation about that. People will often say, yeah, we know that that's not the same thing. But it's like, but we haven't actually looked at what would it mean to have a conversation about fair finance. Inclusion filters through structural oppression. A combination of caste, gender, and migrant disadvantage make debt fall differentially on households with a similar income. And depletion, exploitative debt over time leads to depletion. If depletion is the cost of caring, then it takes a toll on individuals, households, and communities. So reversing depletion for India's majority requires a careful examination of credit and debt systems, which are expanding in the absence of basic social safety nets. So if you think about this more broadly, all this financial inclusion is actually subsidizing the state, because the state no longer isn't paying for C-sections, isn't paying for basic medical care and basic emergencies that people encounter in their everyday life. So that's kind of the punchline. Thank you so much. And I think I'm okay on time. Yeah. Oh, we're going to do comments first. Great.
Okay, so thank you for that wonderful talk. It's always amazing just to, there's so much we still don't know about India.
Yeah.
Right.
It's incredible.
And so it's incredible to get data.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of thoughts in my head. I'll try to be succinct, but I don't know if I will be because there's a lot of questions I have. And then after I talk, our wonderful Yamini Iyer will offer her thoughts. Okay. So, wow, this is very I think a lot of the. Okay, I think is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so first, I have a lot of questions.
Okay, great.
Let me try to be organized. Maybe I'll start with this, the micro questions and work towards the theoretical questions. Okay. What really struck me about the three people that you talked about at the end is the fact that the highest income earner is more depleted.
Yes.
Okay. I found that very interesting and weird.
Yeah.
And I want you to theorize that more.
Yeah.
So the highest income earner, the woman, is despondent.
Yeah.
Then we have two men who are earning the same amount of money.
Yeah.
And one of them is I'm okay.
Yeah.
And the other is in crisis.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, does the debt industry actually help us understand why it is that income is not, and as a sociologist, I would expect that income would be determinative of life outcomes.
Yes.
And here it's not.
It's not.
It's not, and of psychological outcomes, which is very bizarre and intriguing.
Yes.
So what's going on? And is it the debt industry, or is it that the debt industry is not rectifying some other much broader social issue, i.e. migration status, i.e. if you're a Brahmin man and you idiotically think things are okay. You know what I mean? I think we should also wonder about the first man's idea that his life is okay. Is it actually okay? Or is he just operating under some idea that I'm a Brahmin man and things are fine, right? So what's going on there? And I wanted a more robust explanation of why our basic sociological intuitions do not play out across these three cases, right? And is it fully explained by the structure of indebtedness or the debt industry, or is it that the debt industry is failing to account for something, which is a slightly different argument.
Agreed.
Right? Okay, so that's my first question. My second question is, what's going on with this breadwinning? Why are these people? Why are you calling them breadwinners?
Yeah,
especially Kavita. She doesn't seem like a breadwinner, right?
She earns more than her husband. Yeah.
Oh, so she is a breadwinner. Do they all think of themselves as breadwinners?
Well, there isn't exactly a Hindi word for that, but they're working because they have to,
right?
And so it's an essential income. Yeah. And some of them don't want to be working, but they still are. And some of the I didn't use any examples from places where they're pooling income with multiple breadwinners, but they're earners. Anyway, I've gotten some pushback about that term, but I'm still into it. But I'm interested in the pushback also.
It might be great. I just need a bit more explanation of how this makes sense, how it makes sense for the people and their identities, right? Why you're using that term, and what kind of analytical or theoretical lens it provides.
Yes.
Why it's necessary.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I'm also very intrigued by what you said about, so the quote you pulled out of this person who's oh no, I've never taken loans. Oh, actually I took this. Yeah. Okay. So you interpret it as loans are taboo, but I'm wondering if there's a different interpretation, which is that some things are not thought of as loans.
Yes, correct.
Right? Not that everyone's this is a loan, but I don't want to talk about it. But just that some acts are not conceived of as loans.
Completely.
And so my question is, does the social construction of what is considered a loan also structure vulnerability? Right? So I can imagine how, and I just don't know as much about this as you do, but that pawning your jewelry will be thought of as very, very different, like a different act, right, than going to a moneylender. And that the very fact that both the person who is doing it and the person who is taking the jewelry, right, think of it as not a loan, potentially creates all sorts of other, because it's not thought of as a loan, that the way you get back your jewelry is by providing free childcare for that. You know what I mean? Like that it actually structures vulnerabilities that are not accounted for in a traditional loan agreement, and potentially provides a richer or more nuanced understanding of depletion. Okay. Now, finally, getting to sort of your theoretical framework. I'm thinking about your prior work, right? As well as the work of people like Lamia Karim, right? Who are, and Karim has a very negative take on microfinance, right? That basically this is a way to extract, but also to exploit women, and that it doesn't create communities at all between women, right? That it breaks communal bonds. And I'm also thinking of your work, and one of the core ideas that I took out from your to both of your books, your recent books, which is that what we've seen under neoliberalism is that there's this discourse of choice and empowerment for women that frames things like loans, microfinance loans, right? But the discourse masks the actuality of extraction and redistribution to less disadvantaged groups, i.e., for example, like the men who are, employed and things like that, right? But that interestingly, the discourse is often internalized by women themselves. Yeah. So one of the questions I have for you, and I know that you have more men in your sample than women, but did you see systematically different forms of interpretation by gender, right? And this links back to my first question, where I'm sort of quizzically interpreting the Brahmin man and his, right, like his overly optimistic view of his life, right? And also sort of struck by the overly negative interpretation that the woman has of her life, right? So yeah, is there a way in which broader social forces or discourses of gender impact how people perceive loans? And therefore, the story of depletion is not simply about a material extraction, but a more nuanced story, right?
So just quickly, on balance, these quotes are idiosyncratic in that sense, because on balance, the women were much more optimistic than the men.
Oh,
so
fascinating.
Yeah, most of the men were like, yep, no future at all, just going to be here, and I don't know, I guess I should send my kids to school, and I guess that's it. Whereas the women were like dropping inspiring quotes, like, whatever my daughter does, I am behind her and I will be there. And, I want her to go, even if I have to struggle, there's this real sense of like, even though it's hard, there's this sense of like struggle will lead to a better outcome, which I actually by and large did not get from the men.
So that itself could be because of the right? Like
that could be
women have access to this, like, I'm a woman, I'm being empowered, right? Where the men are like, this is terrible.
Yes.
Like nobody's
never
trying
going
to empower
anywhere.
me.
That's right.
Like, I don't know. Or it could be just that, like if you look at health data in India, right? Like men are always complaining and like, I'm so sick. And women are actually really sick, but they're like, I'm okay.
I'm fine.
It could just be like it could be like gender inequality working in the other direction.
Right.
Where men are like, things are so not working out the way I expected. Nevertheless, that would be an interesting sort of.
It's just hard with my data to analyze, because that was what I actually thought that I would be looking at. Yeah. But then when the data actually shook out, I was like, I don't really know how I would do that comparative thing systematically.
But maybe within the men.
Within the group.
And within the men.
Within
there
the men,
might be interesting differences.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, my final comment, and then I'll stop talking, is that I do like Shireen Rai's book, right? Like, I love that book. I love the concept of depletion. But I do wonder if you're underselling what you're doing by saying that
it's all about that.
This is, right? So I encourage you to use this very rich data to develop your own concept, because I think there's a lot here that depletion does not cover. And in fact, some of the most puzzling things in the data that you presented today to me are not fully
about that.
Explained by this term. So I will end there and turn it over to you.
Thank you. This is absolutely fascinating, not least because my first job was with an NGO in India, working in northern India, including in Uttarakhand. And I was tasked with documenting the stories of women in self-help groups, because it was early 2000s. That's when all the self-help group movement had kind of taken off. Lots of NGOs in India were receiving large amounts of funding to pursue these ideas. The government was becoming more and more interested in financial inclusion. Self-help groups became the mechanism. And I spent a good 6-8 months traveling around, visiting other NGOs and talking to women self-help groups around questions of how they thought about how they thought about their finances, their own livelihoods, their understandings of empowerment. I was quite young, idealistic, and relatively underskilled for the job at hand, but it was quite an insightful experience. And many of the stories that you had to tell had degrees of resonance, but also great degrees of difference from that moment of the early phase of financial inclusion to the present. And there's been a lot of kind of shifts in Indian economy, Indian society, that I think all speak to this. So to me, like, just in my head, I have no way of empirically, converting all of this into something more substantive. But the contrast was just fascinating, and I think I'm going to offer my comments from that perspective, just as ways of thinking about the narratives you are bringing out, because like Palomi said, I do think that the story you have is much deeper and than simply the framed within the concept of depletion. It actually speaks a lot more to the nature of our economic structures and the relationship, to my mind, that people have with the state and what the state is simply unable to provide, which is creating the context of indebtedness and precariety that you're bringing out in different ways. And of course, there the intersectionalities of caste, gender play a big role in shaping how people articulate their aspirations and their sense of precarity as well. And I think the very important point that Palomi brought up was the difference between the aspirational Brahmin male versus the relatively economically better off but exhausted and depleted female voice is quite interesting. So let me say a few things. I think that the origins of the self-help group movement and a remark that you made, as it moves from a non-profit NGO community mobilization imagination to this very rarefied, male-dominated, upper caste, financial inclusion, formalized story. It's actually, you said it in passing, but I think it's actually very, very crucial because the original sort of Seva-led mobilizational effort around financial inclusion was really not actually about financial inclusion per se, but a much deeper effort at widening the at shifting the economic structures in ways that created greater opportunities for women, and the ways in which the self-help group movement was presented, and particularly when you trace its history to the anti-liquor mobilization in Andhra Pradesh, from where the first experiments came about, it has a history in mobilization, and a mobilization that sought to challenge structures of exploitation in the economy, in which economic empowerment became a vehicle for larger change, with financial inclusion or banking, women's banking, much more as a tool rather than an end in itself. And I think that it's in this translation of financial inclusion being a tool to becoming an end in itself, where now we say, by virtue of the Jan Dhan Yojana and all these financial, the digitization of the economy, we are quote unquote formalizing the economy, and that is how the economy is going to grow. We've kind of completely moved away from the original mobilizational imagination, and all the precarity that you're talking about, it comes fundamentally from a deeply exploitative economy. You're talking where even the so-called formal employment that these the three janitors that you describe have. I mean, we know from PLFS data, the only data that we have right now in India of any value is the periodic labor force survey data. And you can see since 2017, the bulk of employment that's being generated is either in precarious agriculture or in what's called self-employment, and contractual employment, where you actually have absolutely no formal safety nets for people who are employed. So inevitably, your relationship with debt is framed by the fact that your source of employment, even when it's contractual, semi-formalized employment that you're describing here, is essentially leaving you in a place, as one of your stories described, like, I can't go to my employer, I'm just a contract employee, there's no chance that I have any social security that emerges out of that. So the fact that we've built an economy in which the bulk of employment is coming largely from this informal, semi-precarious space, and that challenge is deepening, I think plays a very, very big role in deepening the structures of indebtedness that we are talking about. So sort of, you ended talking about safety nets. I would not use the word safety nets. It's actually an economic structure that is growing in a framing that feeds the top 10%, lifts a large bulk of the bottom out of extreme poverty, but has never been able to tackle this very fundamental problem about precarity. And all the financial inclusion talk that we have today in India, which is now growing into my current bugbear, the cash transfers kind of safety net structure that we're building. And what are we saying? We are saying we have built financial inclusion such that everybody has a bank account. And because everybody has a bank account, all these women are getting 2,500 rupees, 3,500 rupees. Every political party is competing with each other to hand out more cash. But it's not actually dealing with these structural questions. And I would, so your narratives actually give a really nice way of thinking about debt and structural constraints of the economy into how it's shaping the everyday experiences of vulnerable of the bulk of India. And what gets layered on this is a very awkward policy conversation, which you refer to right in the beginning, financial literacy and management, right? Yeah. So in the last 10 years, in fact, Modi's first kind of big shift that he tried and then never really pursued, but all the kind of liberal economist reformers were super excited about it at the time when Modi was still presenting himself as the kind of potential next Thatcher Reagan for India, was that we will think about co-contributory financial services as the anchor of the social safety net structure that we were going to build, right? So it was, he positioned all this rights-based kind of programs that the previous regime had put in place as entitlements, and we are going to talk about empowerment, and a first element of that empowerment are going to be these schemes, and two, in a sense, he put his money where his mouth is, because within the first year or two, if I'm not wrong, there were rapid sets of announcements of these co-contributory social insurance schemes that were de-linked from employment, because they did understand that in a very informal economy, you can't link these two things. But they never really took off. There was Atal Pension Yojana. There was a whole set of acronyms around all of these. They never really took off, and the insurance there are a lot of these kind of emerging out of the microfinance industry of these consulting firms and NGOs as well, who are trying to do financial inclusion and serve as a conduits and the bridge. And their constant complaint was financial literacy, that you have this army. They were working largely in urban areas, so meeting people like your interviewees. And the argument was always that, we have a young population, they should be thinking thinking of their long-term financial histories, but financial futures, but there's no interest in it because it's all because of the lack of financial literacy. They all want immediacy. But what they missed, of course, was that, of course you want immediacy because you're located in a structure of precarity. And in fact, in a worst case scenario, it may lead you to the loan shark, but you can depend on the presence of the loan shark. That's the only dependable reality that you have.
Yes.
So this inability to understand that structure, I think has really undermined the possibilities of seriously linking where you began economic exploitation, economic structures, and financial inclusion to create a more holistic understanding of the context in which debt, economic opportunities, and financial tools of inclusion can come together to solve for a lot of challenges. And I just I know this is not related to the larger theoretical framework, but I do think that backdrop could help you kind of take out some of the richness of the narratives that you have on what we know and understand about how people understand debt, engage with debt, but also think about their own I don't know if their power or their agency is the right way to put it, but how do you think of their own capacities within this context? Because the capacities are shaping their sense of identity and aspiration and future. And just one last thing, I don't know how to theorize this, but living in India, I experience this all the time because, of course, we are all supported in our professional lives by this army of women from who come and help us out. And the constant challenge, and it really is a challenge, is that a lot of women who support upper income households in cosmopolitan, in most parts of India, are also locked in debt, and they depend on you as the employee consistently to feed and fuel their debt. And I was once in a meeting with somebody talking about health insurance, who was an Indian American who had come to India for a few years, who was very frustrated with the lack of financial literacy of the average Indian, because he had offered to his household staff, in place of the Diwali bonus, health insurance. And he said, I wanted to give them choice. So I said, Diwali bonus, health insurance. And oh my God, Indians are so financially illiterate. They don't understand their own security. They all took the bonus. And I'm just looking at it and going, yeah, because you're the security. Like if something happens, they are going to come. That is the expectation. That is the nature of the way in which these relationships of exploitation are structured. And it's very hard to exit out of them. Because almost because they exist, it kind of feeds and funnels the story that you told of, I am giving my nanny yet another loan. In fact, I'm sitting here and she's calling me saying I need yet another loan. I don't feel like saying no, but why am I giving you the loan? Because she's taken a loan from someone else in her family who needs to be, and so we are sort of stuck in these cycles of debt. And the relationships and networks, both the exploitative ones and the potentially less exploitative ones, I hope ours is less exploitative, feed and funnel this further. So breaking out of these cycles is also a challenge. And I'd be very intrigued to hear to see if there are things in your data that give us insights into what can be done to break out of these societal expectations of debt.
Amazing. Should I respond or should we take some questions?
Whatever you want. Because, it's up to you. We have like 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. No, I mean, I really enjoyed these comments from both of you. Thank you. I wrote down so much. Just to your last point, Yamini. So that one of the books that I mentioned by Garan and her colleagues talks about this in some depth. And I actually coincidentally met her this week because this was just one of those weeks when everything happened in the same week. But, she makes this point that it's not debt itself that's the problem. It's hierarchical debt, right? It's debt that reinforces and sustains hierarchies. Right. And that is really where, and that relates to a lot of your other points. And, anyway, it's helpful to think about it because it's not that we don't want to have debt at all. Right. It's that we want debt that is, going to sustain, more equitable social relationships. Right. Not ones that are going to exacerbate, inequality and therefore exacerbate potential levels of exploitation or real levels of exploitation, which for women often like end in the body in one way or another.
I would say that I think what's most interesting about Yamini's story is that the women actively choose the more hierarchical and personalized
one, right? Because they have more negotiating power.
Potentially.
Or it stresses you out more.
Right.
But actually, sorry, though, that just one thing I wanted to ask you, if your data can help us understand. So, you showed how those in formal employment tend not to go to formal banks for loans, etc.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of class and caste plays a role. I mean, this is something that I've just experienced, just witnessed, just from being around. But I've never seen data on this. How easy is it for a lower caste man or just a poor person to walk into a bank where the bank manager is kind of sitting in this very formalized structure? And does the psychological barrier then make it easier to, despite the long-term indebtedness, go back to the loan shark?
Yeah, I don't have data about that, but I think some of those psychological barriers, I think, have been alleviated by financial inclusion, right? Because women are used to going to the bank branch and collecting their, they, in my book, I talk about, like the ritual of disbursement, right? And everyone comes and there is someone sitting behind the desk, but then there's also like an intermediary who came to your neighborhood who's like, hey, come over, sit down. It's all, I'm going to hand you cash. Right. So that psychological barrier is not there, but there is still actually this barrier of collateral and job security and all the economic structures that you talked about that really do determine whether or not someone feels like they can take advantage of that kind of inclusion. So anyway, there's so many amazing people here, so I'd love to hear more. But thank you for these amazing comments. I wrote so many things down, and I'm grateful for your insight that it like I kind of started with depletion as a framework, but maybe that's not where the whole thing will end up. So, I appreciate sort of thinking about it more broadly. So, questions, comments? Yeah. Hi. And tell me your name, because I don't know you.
No worries. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
My name is Asil. I'm a PhD student in religious studies. Not much of a sociology background, but this was thoroughly enjoyable and rich. Thank you very much. I have a few questions, which I'll hope to go through quite quickly and briefly. So the word care work comes up in the beginning of your presentation, and then I think it disappears. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about it in relation to breadwinning or not, especially given that the examples you've offered show that breadwinning and care work are not necessarily gender divisions of labor.
Yes.
So in instances where the woman is doing both the care work and the breadwinning, is this then a compounded or complicated or further depletion? How does that work? My second question has to do with the concept of depletion itself, and I would love to hear more about how it's different from exploitation. The way it strikes me is that there is something consequential about depletion in accelerated time that makes it seem like there's a tipping point, maybe even premature death, which means probably, and I don't know how it works in India, but maybe the inheritance of the debt by folks in the family. So I'm wondering, what does depletion offer more than just exploitation? And with that idea in mind, and thinking about your title, and I don't mean to be facetious, but I mean, who is this hidden for? We understand, I mean, again, I'm not a sociologist, but I've done enough Marxist readings. I'm aware of similar situations in Egypt, my home country, where I don't think these are hidden for folks, and I don't think it's hidden for scholars who've been thinking a lot or being critical about neoliberal illusions of exactly what you said about agency and autonomy. And so I still feel like there is something, maybe I'm pushing back against the claim that there's more than just depletion. I'm actually curious about, there's something about the consequentialism of depletion, or the urgency maybe the immediacy and the criticalness of it, that I think might be a more useful framework. But I would like to hear more about why you've said this is hidden. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Those are great questions, and I appreciate them very much. This actually goes back to Paulami's question about breadwinning, so it gives me a chance to answer both. I appreciate that. In my work on neoliberalism, I kind of talk about, with my colleague Cynthia Solari, about, that the ideal of the male breadwinner is not really possible under neoliberalism for the majority of people. And so there has not been much theorizing that looks at those who do both breadwinning and caregiving. And I actually think most of the people I interviewed, and then I include the men in that, do some caregiving. It's not so binary, right? And I think we sometimes get trapped in that. And so I'm trying to talk about breadwinners who also care, right? And who are being depleted by both. So I like your conception of compounded, because I think that is what's going on here. And I'm wedded, analytically, what do we get out of breadwinning? Because, this idea of an essential wage. So what is the contrast to breadwinning? The contrast to breadwinning is like pocket money or a side wage or a non-essential wage, which is not actually what we're talking about here. We're talking about an essential household wage where if it's not there, then someone will not eat. And so I would love to contribute. I don't know if this study is going to do it, but I would love to contribute to a larger conversation that looks at breadwinning and caregiving as overlapping, and one that, folks of different genders are going to undertake differentially at different times. But, one of the biggest finding surprises for me from the data is that a lot of the men are talking about the loans that they took out for, their wives' birth-related issues, right? Whether it's, prenatal care or postnatal care or whatever, that's taken out as a household, right? And it's taken out literally for reproduction, but often for the care of children and for other matters. So I do see those as interlinked, and I would like to, theorize that better. It's sort of by the by in this paper, but I think that's where that's coming from anyway. I think care work, I didn't mean for it to drop out, because I'm trying to be attentive to what kinds of strategies that people use to manage that economic hardship. Here I focus on loans, but they also talked about, right, I just eat less. I have to pay the loan, but I just eat less, or I feed my kids and not myself, right? So there's other kinds of strategies there that involve care work. Here I focus just on the loans, but for the paper, I could definitely clarify that further. And then as far as I appreciate your final question about who is it hidden from. This actually also relates to Poulami's earlier comment that, for sociologists, you think, hey, if a household's making 22,000 rupees, they should be all right, in urban Uttarakhand, if this person is having a disaster, clearly they've just done something wrong, right? So I suppose the term hidden is, maybe it's not, obviously not hidden to those folks, but I actually think it's hidden to lots of folks. I think it's hidden to the Indian public as well, who really, my collaborator on this, Safal Batra, when he started, he accompanied me to some of these interviews, and he was managing the research team as it was coming in, and he was genuinely shocked to know how little people earned. And these are people in his own town, and people, some of whom that he interacted with. And he found it truly shocking to know how they are managing and how little that money really is. He really had no idea. And the majority of people that I talked to in India would think that these folks with this type of a background and this type of stable employment would actually be more like Vijay, right? I'm okay. It might be nice to be more comfortable, but there's still a future. And so the stories of desperation that came out of that group were actually not obvious to most folks. Thank you for your questions. Yes.
Thank you for that really wonderful talk. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
I'm still thinking. There must be something in the air about Uttarakhand right now, because in the last week I've read 3 books on Uttarakhand.
Oh, please tell me what they are.
They're not, in sociology. I'm an anthropologist in religious studies.
Yes, there's a lot in anthropology. Yes.
And so William Sachs, who's written about Mahabharata performances in the Uttarakhand area. The other was Radhika Govindarajan, Animal Intimacies. Yeah. And that really interesting relationship between people and animals in that region, domestic animals and source of income and so on. And the third one actually was most interesting, which relates to the question I want to ask you, which is, so this was Aftab Jassal, whose book is just out on place making in Uttarakhand. And he talks about gods in the world. So all of these, intersect with religious studies in different sorts of ways. And so my question, I'm landing on the question on the idea of hardship.
Yeah.
The ways in which you cut it through your work, that idea. One of the things I've learned from Aftab's book is that so he's worked in both the Kumaon as well as the Garal region. So the whole, I don't know where Paharpur fits into your geography of things. And he describes these incredible Jagar performances or events, ritual events that take place in which people, come, experience divine embodiment or possession, the older term for that would be. And it becomes a space in which lots of grievances and hardships are voiced, along with, ritual methods that are employed to remedy or alleviate or address those concerns. I got really interested in the gender narrative around these Jagar events, where one of the things that happens is, identifying women who are experiencing depletion in various sorts of ways, and the manifestations of that, fatigue, the kinds of things that you described. And when he Aftab talked to women, when he talked to all the men, and he could talk more to the men than he could to the women, he talked to the men around, women who are experiencing, something, and the families identify, mostly the male members of the families identified female depletion in terms of, she's possessed by a spirit. Okay, so that spirit has to be addressed. And it's a very complicated system, which it's easy to dismiss if you're sort of a certain mindset, but it's pretty complicated. And so they address, depletion is understood in terms of, all sorts of networked hardships. But when you talk to the women, and this is what I find really interesting, is that when you talk to the women, they're talking in terms of, mushkil hai baat. Difficulties, I'm feeling not good. Or they say, or they use the word troubles, mushkile. And so there's such a difference in the way in which depletion is perceived by men and women. And that just is, speaks to the point that you were making earlier, all of you were actually making earlier. But how do you come to this? How do you sort of problematize this idea of hardship using the kind of very rich socio-religious landscape of the place? That element. And I just want to hear a little more about, some of the religious discourses in the place, which actually swing between religion and exploitation. And in fact, Aftab, who's watching some of these Jagar and these exorcism events, says, I found myself so troubled by what looked like, patriarchal forms of violence being effected on a lot of these women who go through these, versus being, really respectful of a kind of a cultural phenomenon that he's trying to document. So this is sort of, I'm not sure where my question is embedded, but it's sort of, if I have to boil it down to something, it's sort of, where is the discourse around religion? I see the intersection with caste. But beyond that, I'm wondering if there's something more in your narratives that can elicit a bigger story of hardship and its different ways in which that's theorized.
Well, that background is really helpful, and I want to go and look at all of these resources. That's definitely something that, as I've been figuring out, how to finally realize the paper, I've been sort of thinking about Uttarakhand as a place and thinking about these different layers. Because we went into the study with a fairly narrow idea of hardship, as in like a response to, an economic crisis. I feel it's sort of narrow the way that we have it in the data. And it might be that but of course, asking about that illuminated these more elaborate stories with that Rakhi story that I told in the beginning. Clearly, this was not just about the broken finger, right? There's been this kind of, was like dispossession that she's experienced right over her entire life, because she was sort of dispossessed of her caste identity through marriage, and then more and more of her resources get dispossessed. So I wonder if there's some kind of a deeper story around that. I don't know if my data can get at it exactly, but I think that it can help situate the way that men and women might narrate hardship differently, which I think gets at some of the earlier questions that were asked. And even if it doesn't fit into this paper, it could be something, to sort of, think about these broader questions. And it relates to the question I didn't answer of yours about like depletion and exploitation as well, so there's like depletion, hardship, right? Exploitation, and then we can add dispossession to it perhaps. And, I think they all do slightly different work. I don't know if we can completely isolate them from one another. But the reason I chose depletion to focus on in this particular paper, which now I don't know if I'll keep it or not, but that was the initial prompt, is that it gave me a site at which to measure cost. So exploitation, generally, when we talk about it or when it's theorized, it's more about what's getting extracted up and not necessarily the cost to the one who is giving it up, I guess. And the depletion framework kind of draws our attention to things like exhaustion and, depression, mental strain. There's another part of this that I didn't talk about, but we didn't go into it with this question in mind, but it was very clear that many of the people we spoke to were just so stressed out. So I started developing like, a strain, a little 3-part, kind of qualification about like how much mental strain was there in this interview? Like, was it severe? Was it like medium, or could you not tell, right? And then looking at the subset where there was a lot of mental strain that came through in the interview, or that there was narratives of frequent economic hardship. So I feel like I can probably get a subset because I did some of that like ranking and like sorting. It might be that I could get a subset of interviews to sort of look for some of these deeper things. Like if there are folks who are expressing frequent hardship and expressed a great deal of mental strain, looking more closely at those to say how they actually narrate those hardships, that it could be a very fruitful direction to surface some of the, religious and spiritual undertones of this. Some of these folks are migrants also to Uttarakhand. And so they may be coming from a different kind of, religious set of imaginings. And it's pretty clear to me those who are migrated from UP are in general they're better off than they were, but like worse off compared to those who have stayed within Uttarakhand or who have come from another town or rural area. But thank you. That was really helpful.
So I think there will be more opportunities after this to talk to Professor Radhakrishnan, but I think I'm going to use my privilege as the organizer to say one more thing, which is that, listening to all of your comments, I realized that one of the questions, so you had these 3 questions, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the questions I'm curious about is why people take loans.
Yeah.
And I think that would actually help us connect the story of social reproduction, right? Especially the person who is leaving right now. Something that came up was this fact that people are taking loans to have a baby.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so why people take loans, I think could actually help you really clearly delineate what the effects of these loans are.
Right.
Because talk about social reproduction. This is
literally reproduction.
And we know what the sources of indebtedness are in India.
Yeah.
Right? It's to pay for your daughter's marriage.
Yes.
Right? It's to have a baby. It's like literally reproducing yourself and your family.
And your family, yes.
And I think that will help you really connect concretely to the body, right?
Yes.
To the physical body, to the social body. I think that's probably already in the data you've collected.
Yeah, and it would just be organizing it in that very, sometimes you need that really direct question to sort of sort through the different meanings that you're looking at.
So one very quick addition to that, also just the matrix of the sources of loans, do they differ depending on the type of vulnerability for which the loan is being sought?
That might be another way to typologize them, right? Rather than the type actually thinking about the cause.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
That would be really interesting. I got to go back and look at all of that.
Sorry.
This is what happens when you have such fabulous data.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming. And thank you all of you for coming and for your wonderful questions. I believe there are samosas outside.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming.
Arranged this. So please.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, everyone, for being